long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I am joined by Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School. And today, we are The Politics Guys. Ken, welcome.
Hey, Trey, it's great to be back.
Yes, it is. And Ken, before we get to the breaking story that we're going to be dealing with, which is Israel's response to Iran, I just wanted to take 2 seconds to really say thank you so much to longtime listener Estevan, who just donated a substantial amount to us via Venmo. So Estevan, thank you so much. Every week when I prep, I take a look at our numbers and I am just reminded of how blessed I am to be doing this show. And it is generous supporters like Estevan who make that possible. And it also means that he's paid attention, or he or she has paid attention and knows that there are lots of ways of supporting the show, which includes Venmo. So again, thank you for using Venmo. Thank you for being a supporter. And most of all, man, thank you for that very generous donation. And I'm really happy to get a chance to call you out here at the beginning of the show. So if you want to be like Estevan and do that as well, you can find us on Venmo at Politics Guys. And maybe you've been listening to the show for a while now. You might want to head to patreon.com/Politics Guys and be like Estevan and see what the different levels of support and make it possible for Ken and myself to keep doing really cool things like this. So again, thank you so much for that gift. We deeply, deeply appreciate it. I know that I appreciate it. It just put a giant smile on my face when Mike reached out to me and said, listen, we've got some fun stuff going on. So I just want to take that moment and say that. So, but let's get to the stuff that why you make those donations. And that's Ken and I's analysis. And, Ken, we kind of thought this was going to happen last week. And I thought it was going to, end up being a Mike and Jay story. And then instead, once again, it could be, maybe what we need to posit is that really international relation items are occurring as a result of our disturbances of the butterfly forces. No, I tease. I want to be clear. I'm teasing about that. I don't think anyone in any capacity has ever said to themselves, I wonder what the doctors are going to do today. We better change policy. But in all honesty, in the serious side, overnight, I was following closely. Israel finally made good and retaliated against Iran's drone and missile attack, which had happened last week. Sources starting last night, including some of reporters that are former students of mine, had called those airstrikes limited. And this morning, as we continue to kind of take a look at that, those descriptions here on Friday hold. The outlets like Wall Street Journal are still calling those limited, Ken. And that kind of attacks narrow scope. We've also noted today that there's been really some mild rhetoric from Iran. Iranian media have noted that they have very much downplayed the attack, and that seems to be an attempt to both be responsive, but an attempt to calm tensions. The best take that I have seen, again, this is really early, is to suggest that what Israel was really doing was not trying to actively blow anything major up, but rather to send the message that they could. The location where they did it is very close to the nuclear sites for Iran, and also through some of their more advanced anti-air defense areas. And so what this really seems to suggest is not so much that it was an active strike attempting to do something major in this moment, but rather to say, see, we can penetrate your defenses. And if we don't calm down, we could hit your nuclear sites. Now, additionally, Israel struck Syria sites as well, which had been home to Revolutionary Guard Corps. And that's something that, Ken, you and I had talked about the last time we were in the show. The Revolutionary Guard from Iran has a very major presence in Syria, however, had actually withdrawn those troops from the areas which so far at least have been reported to have been hit to again say, we know where you are, we can get to you there. Israel, of course, has not mentioned anything specific in regards to the strikes. So, again, as of Friday morning, that's where we're standing right now. Ken, what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, well, to me, some of the most interesting things that happened over the past week, I know the attack started probably right after Mike and Jay recorded last week's show, so I guess they didn't have a chance to talk about it at all. But I found it very interesting that some of the Arab states apparently participated with the U.S. and Israel in different aspects of shooting down the Iranian missile.
For example, yes.
Yeah, Jordan apparently shot down at least one of the missiles and made statements saying that they were just protecting their own airspace, but obviously, they were also helping protect Israel. And similarly, although I don't think Saudi Arabia did anything like that, the Wall Street Journal reported that Iran had notified Saudi Arabia that they were going to launch this attack, and that Saudi Arabia immediately passed that information along to the U.S. for the purpose of passing it along to Israel, so that actually helped the U.S. and Israel prepare the defense. So to me, that there's a really interesting, you see this geopolitically, that even with the war that's going on in Gaza, some of the movements towards normalization that Israel had been undertaking for years with some of its Arab neighbors, the war in Gaza disrupted that, but it seems not to have completely derailed that. And some of those Arab states, I think, even right now today, see Iran as much more of a problem than they see Israel as. And so I think that's interesting. I fully agree with your assessment that what Israel did today, striking very close to where Iran's nuclear facilities are, but not striking the nuclear facilities, and with a missile attack that got through and was not, Iran couldn't block it. That was a much smaller attack on Iran than the one that Iran launched on Israel, but all of it got through. All of Israel's attack got through and hit Iran, whereas virtually all of Iran's attack was blocked and didn't get through and hit Israel. So I think they were sending a message that they can hit whatever they want, including Iran's nuclear facilities, and hopefully that will be exactly the right message to tamp down further tit for tats.
Do you think, I know one of the concerns has been that Netanyahu would effectively far too belligerent in its response. This seemed to be, to me, a relatively balanced response to the attack, and not what I think a lot of people had feared might have been a more belligerent. What is your take on that that view from the Netanyahu point of view as well?
It certainly was a measured response. I think it was actually more belligerent than what the U.S. was pushing for. I think the U.S. would have probably been pressuring Netanyahu for no response, because after all, Israel started it when Israel killed all the Iranian generals that were inside the embassy in Syria, and then when Iran retaliated for that, the retaliation, the missile attack on Israel, was fully neutralized. None of it got through. And I think from the U.S. standpoint, they were already leaning on Netanyahu. All right, let's tamp this down. We're done. You killed their generals. We blocked their attack. Let's not have an escalation here. And so I think the fact that Netanyahu felt that Israel will never let any missile attack on Israel go unresponded to, that's already, I think, more belligerent of a response than what the U.S. wanted. But I think it was a reasonably measured response, because it was much more demonstrative than severe. Right? It didn't kill people, or at least, and it didn't kill very many people, and no civilians, and it didn't it just made the point that Israel can get missile attacks through. And I think it was both a reasonably measured response that probably will end further escalation, but yet I think it was also probably a more belligerent response than what the U.S. would have wanted to see.
Now, of course, the other thing, and it may or may not be a purposeful or non-purposeful timing, but the other item that happened last night, or at least yesterday afternoon, as we're getting close to last night, was the U.S. Security Council not passing the vote to allow the Palestinian Authority, which has been controlled by Hamas, to join the United Nations with a vote of 12-1. For those who don't follow this closely, the United Nations has a primary split between two bodies: the General Assembly, in which all countries get one vote, and then you have what's called the Security Council, which are supposed to be the major players, kind of the realist view in international relations of the major players. And on that Security Council, the kind of the key of the key are what are called the permanent members. There are 5 permanent members according to the UN Charter, and any member can have a veto. And in this case, even though you have a 12-1 vote, the country that's voting against it is the United States, and we have a permanent seat on the Security Council, which effectively ends that. And so it's hard not to see that as being linked a little bit. The Palestinian Authority had originally asked the Security Council to reconsider its 2011 application. But again, in that era, it was even a little bit more knocked down, again, because of its connection by Hamas. And so what are your thoughts on the timing of that, if any, Ken?
Well, of course, Palestine has the sympathies of a lot of the world right now, so it makes sense that they would, take opportunity to try to raise once again the question of whether they could be recognized as a state by the United Nations. I think there is a lot of sympathy, and as you point out, all the countries except for the U.S. that are on the Security Council did vote to recognize them. It does not surprise me that the U.S. continued to veto that. The U.S. policy really under both Democratic and Republican administrations has been that there has to actually be a peace agreement. And, at different times, the U.S. has done more or less to move that process along of getting to a peace agreement. But the U.S. policy has never been to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state before there's any comprehensive peace agreement with Israel. So I'm not surprised that veto continued. And also, I think the domestic politics here are much more pro-Israeli than pro-Palestinian even now. So again, I'm not surprised. One
last thing that has struck me, this has been, to bring it to presidential politics in the United States, has definitely been a tightrope for President Biden to walk. One of the things I had noticed about this was I try to follow a wide spectrum from both the right and the left. And from my left spectrum, this was really just viewed as just terrible, absolutely terrible. And so I wonder, do you think that this continues to be a wedge? Because this is an actual vote, right? Before, you're kind of always saying, well, where does he stand on this policy? You're kind of you're not taking an active stance to prevent what's happening in Gaza. But in this particular instance, you're taking a positive vote. The president could have directed it to go a different direction and opted to not do that. What do you think about that in terms of presidential politics in the United States?
I think you're right that the locus of opinion within the Democrats could shift enough at some point that a Democratic president would actually choose to recognize the Palestinian Authority. Now, I don't think any president's ever going to recognize Hamas, and right now the Palestinian Authority has no role in Gaza. So we're really only talking about the West Bank, not Gaza. But
which would be part of the problem as it stands today, because the 2011 would be all of it.
Right. Well, is that right? I don't know if we recognize the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority doesn't have jurisdiction in Gaza, so I don't know.
I would have to look at that. I'm going to pull that back just slightly, because I'm not as positive as I thought about that. So I'm gonna pause on that statement there, Ken. But continue the general thought there with the presidency, and I'll look at that just a little bit more as you're talking.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's pitfalls even for the people who are pro-Palestinian, I think, to want to see, and I'm going to base this on my assumption that recognizing of the Palestinian Authority only really means recognizing representation of the people who live in places where the Palestinian Authority is, and that's really only the West Bank. That's not.
It wouldn't
Gaza.
Just be the West Bank. I'm looking more specifically at the UN documents here. That would be just. It would just be for the West Bank.
Yeah, just be for the West Bank. So that actually leaves Gaza, which is the area where the most conflict is, kind of outside of that and in a totally unresolved status. And in fact, it takes a step towards, the world recognizing that Gaza has been severed from the West Bank and that there's not just one Palestine anymore. And so I think that that's problematic even for people from a pro-Palestinian position. I would think that the Palestinians who want Palestinian representation want that to represent want representation that would be representing people in both the West Bank and Gaza. And so the Palestinian Authority can't really do that. And so, I do think that we could get to a point where, I mean, it may take a little while for the present conflict in Gaza to be resolved, but I think we could get to a point where if Netanyahu, doesn't, start listening to the U.S. a little bit more, that, I think if you think of Biden himself as kind of in the very moderate wing of the Democratic Party on these issues, certainly not the most pro-Palestinian wing of the Democratic Party, but he's getting very vexed with Netanyahu, right? And I think
he said that. I mean, he has said that explicitly,
right? So I think the more that basically everyone on the Democratic side of the aisle, and even probably some moderate Republicans, are getting very vexed with Netanyahu, the more that's creating political conditions where the U.S. At least under Democratic administration, might be able to move towards recognizing Palestine as a counterweight. But I really think that we're not there yet. I think that's kind of a last resort. And I think what the U.S. would much rather do is have a more productive engagement with Israel that pushes them towards a more productive engagement with the Palestinians. And get to a settlement that both sides can agree to, and then recognize Palestine.
No, I agree, but of course, what that functionally means is that there is not even a moderate length amount of time in which that occurs.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know when or how the current conflict in Gaza ends, but I cannot see anything like that occurring while this conflict is still going on.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think this brings us to our second story, Ken, because it overlaps in some ways with that, but it's got its own narrative as well. And that is the ongoing Ukraine, Israel, and Pacific funding deal that Johnson has been putting forward. And this has been tricky over the last couple of weeks for Speaker Johnson. So you've got Gaetz and you've got Boebert and some other Republicans who have been deeply concerned that Johnson was going to try to change the threshold on what a motion to vacate takes in the House. So as just a reminder for listeners, what that means is the ability to bring a motion that brings down the speaker or triggers a new speaker vote. And that was a concession made by McCarthy so that he could become speaker, was to lower that. You only need one individual to bring that forward. And so Johnson had made a statement on X that critiqued the current rule, but said that he'd allow it to stand for now. And that wasn't enough for Green and others who have already, in fact, filed that motion to oust him. And the reason this is becoming tricky is Johnson is clearly trying to evolve his position on funding. And he effectively did change some positions. Specifically, he argued earlier in the year that Ukraine can't come up, now saying it has to come up as a bill. And this is what he said. He says, quote, "This is not a game. It's not a joke. We have to do the right thing, and I'm going to allow an opportunity for every single member of the House to vote on their conscience and their will on this. And I think that's the way this institution is supposed to work, and I'm willing to take personal risk for that, because we have to do the right thing and history will judge us," end quote. Now, the way he's trying to make this maybe slightly more palatable for some of his own caucus is he is bringing these bills together as 4 separate bills that, if they all get passed, will then move forward, but none of them dealing with border security, which is primarily where he had originally kind of drawn a line in the sand. As it stands right now, there is a $26.4 billion Israeli aid bill. There is a $60.8 billion for Ukraine aid bill, an $8.1 billion for Indo-Pacific aid, along with a bill that would include one of the things that we had already talked about, Ken, a couple of weeks ago, a ban on TikTok and some other items, seemingly to be kind of a bipartisan win. Now, things weren't looking particularly promising, but then today, late yesterday, as a matter of fact, the Rules Committee in the House made a really unusual move. Now, we're going to get into some inside baseball here for a second, and this is my wheelhouse, right? So if you want to understand the House and a meeting, well, really either chamber of Congress, you have to understand their committee structures. And one of their most important elements of committees are what are called standing committees. And these are the bodies that then kind of receive legislation after it comes to the speaker is filed, and they're going to kind of look at it and take a look at those things first. But not all of those committees are equal, because in the House, you have so many people. The idea is that you can't always be debating about how long it's going to take to debate and items like that. So there's one special committee that you need to be aware of. It's called the Rules Committee, and it's undoubtedly the most important committee in the House. And what it does is it attaches rules of debate. And this is going to come up important as we think about and work through these 4 bills that Johnson are bringing forward. How long is there going to be debate? Can you have amendments or not? Now, generally speaking, the Rules Committee is a completely partisan, always has been, item. The members that control will vote for the particular rules for every bill that's coming forward after they've kind of narrowed it down to what they want, and then the minority party will vote against those. But on late Thursday, there was a 9-3 vote where you actually had Democrats crossing the aisle to get these 4 bills across, because Chip Roy of Texas, Thomas Massie of Kentucky, and Ralph Norman of South Carolina voted no, which is highly unusual. And even more unusual than having a defector in the party is going to be the minority party defecting to make the majority's bill come forward. Now, the other bit here, though, I noted one of the important elements is whether or not bills can have amendments. Of the 4, only the Ukraine aid bill can have amendments. Now, a heads up, amendments can slow the process of passing a bill down significantly. So oftentimes you see amendments possible on bills that are less likely to pass, or bills where you need to try to find more consensus. So it is very telling for, if you're if you follow this closely, or you're a scholar, you're a congressional scholar, you're going to look at that and go, okay, this is unique. This is worth paying attention to. So the Ukraine bill will undoubtedly be a little bit different to other 3 counterparts because of that. Now, I can't say for certain, will that stop it or not, but it certainly means we have to think about it a little bit more. And this has led again to this big kind of divide where Republicans are really kind of, you both have, can we continue to spend money? That's one set of attacks on these bills. The more traditional fiscal conservative policy. But of course, one of the things that we followed has been there's obviously a growing anti-Ukraine movement among other Republicans. And those two overlap to some degree and are separate to some degree, but they align on this particular issue. It seems like they're going to potentially be able to pass. Now, I will say, I do understand, at least from those on the side just saying, hey, we got to think about these top 9 line numbers. Passing this bill is about 1/10 of our recently passed $1.2 trillion spending earlier this bill. So, I get taking a look at it on that front. I'm not as supportive of holding Ukraine separately and differently from the other kinds of aid packages we're thinking about in general, whatever those top line numbers will be. And then, of course, the Senate will take these up as one total bill if they are all passed by Saturday night. Okay, there's a lot going on there, Ken. Thoughts?
Yeah, I was just trying to take a look at the rule, and this is a very developing story. It just passed this morning. Yeah. It looks to me that although exactly as you said, the amendments can be offered on the Ukraine funding piece of it and not on the other pieces of it, it's only 2. There's limited to 2 amendments. So there's a limit to how long that's going to be able to be tied up with amendments. And my sense is that that's not really a tool that's going to let these votes get delayed past today, although by the time the listeners hear this, they'll know. But I think it's really more just a consolation prize being given to opponents that they'll be able to, get votes just to put people on record on what, how they would vote on these amendments. But that it's if the number of amendments is limited to 2, that's not going to slow things down by more than a day. The things that I'm most interested in all this, it seems almost certain that because of the way Johnson moved this and the fact that he can only afford to lose 2 Republicans before he could have a motion to vacate.
And he's already lost 2 Republicans.
He's already lost 2. Yeah. I take it that Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massie, at least, are going to introduce a motion to vacate. And without any Democratic votes to save Johnson, that motion would be successful and Johnson would be dumped.
Well,
And-
I have a suggestion on that, Ken.
Okay,
I
yeah.
think one of the reasons, I think the reason that Johnson moves when he does is he has gotten promises from enough Democrats that they're going to save him. That is my.
Yeah.
I would say that Johnson has at some point gone in and said, look, I'm sympathetic to putting these up for a vote, but I'm not putting them up for a vote if it means I'm out, 72 hours later. So
Yeah.
you've got I don't understand you're not all going to vote for me, but I need enough votes that I stay speaker. And I would be absolutely floored if it wasn't the case that we see, I don't know, a dozen Democrats cross the line so that he remains speaker.
Yeah, I basically agree that that's what's going to happen. I might have a little bit of different view of what the mechanism is of how we'll get there. I think that either of two things are possible, but neither exactly the way you said it. So,
Okay.
I don't think the Democrats would make an agreement like that unless they got something out of it. Not just this vote, but some guarantees about some kind of power sharing going forward. So I think to me the two possibilities are, one, there actually has been an agreement like that, so that the Democrats have already agreed to vote to save Johnson's job, but in exchange for that, Johnson's had to give them more than just this one vote. He's had to agree to keep using this kind of procedure in other situations as well going forward. Or alternatively, the other thing I think could be happening is Johnson could just be gambling. He might not have any agreement with the Democrats, but and not have offered them anything. But I think he might be gambling that they're not going to want to throw him out over this, and that unlike Kevin McCarthy, who was constantly bad mouthing Democrats and lying to them and tricking them about things and backing away from promises and giving the Democrats really no reason to try to save him, that Johnson has been a little bit, he's only been in there for a shorter time, but I think he's been a little more straightforward, a little more honest, a little less divisive, and I think that he may just be gambling that the Democrats will think, well.
I think he's actually getting. I think the thing that I hear you.
Yeah.
And I don't entirely disagree, but I think the things that Democrats are getting is, I think Democrats wanted these to be independent votes. Here's why. Because this allows many Democrats to vote no on the Israeli bill.
Yeah, and it also allows many Republicans to vote no on the Ukraine bill.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think right now, what's going to be this way, Democrats do not have to seem divisive in the same way that they would if you had a singular bill the way the Senate did. And so I agree the Democrats are getting something, but I think part of what they got, in fact, the fact that Israel is separate. Because if from Johnson's point of view, the only one here that is really a bill that would need to be separate is Ukraine. Why separate the other pieces of it? Why not just have two? You could do Ukraine and everything else. But he didn't do that. Instead, we have 4 independent bills. And I think you have 4 independent bills because Democrats didn't want because you're going to see, I think, at least 17 votes, 18 Democratic votes, no more on the Israeli bill. That's my thought.
Well, I do agree with that, but I still think the Democrats would want to negotiate for more than that, because for one thing, the having the 4 separate votes serves interests of both parties. And for another thing, Johnson couldn't have even gotten this rule clear without a 2/3 vote. So he actually needed a lot of Democratic votes, to be able to pass this rule. So I think the Dems have more leverage than that if they're going to make a deal, basically. And I think they're aware how much leverage they've got. So I think for them to make a deal and guarantee that they will give Johnson the votes that he needs to keep to keep Johnson as speaker, what they're really talking then is about a coalition government, a power sharing agreement. And so I think it's not going to be enough to just say, if you'll do this one military funding bill, the structured the way we want it, we'll keep you in. I think they have more leverage than that, and they could say, if you want us to keep you in, we got to keep operating this way, where you keep coming to us, and we keep structuring all the bills in a bipartisan way, or else you're out. So I really think if there's a deal, it's a more comprehensive deal. But I also think, and I don't know that there is or isn't a deal, I think based on what you said, that this was basically did serve the Democrats' interests, I think Johnson could have been gambling. I think with no deal at all, he could just say, look, I'm kind of at a point where, I'm stepping onto the boat here and I've got one foot on the dock and one foot on the boat. And now the boat's taking off and I need to figure out, which is the safer place to be. And I can't stay on both anymore. And I think he just kind of gambled, if I do this one bill the way the Democrats want, and if I haven't given them any reason at all to want to get rid of me and replace me with a different Republican, that maybe I'll just get enough votes from them, even though I haven't gotten a deal for that. And so I think that's possible. Also, I fully agree with your prediction that Democratic votes will save him. I don't think he's going to be ousted as Speaker.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I think, Arn, and I don't think that, and this is something worth explaining on a little bit, which is there's sometimes a little bit of a mystery. Why have Republicans kind of struggled with withholding the House this particular time? And I think it's because precisely we have the idea that parties are monolithic wholes, and they're not. And normally that's not a big deal. But the narrow amount of votes that Republicans won ended up putting them in a position where they can't really govern like the majority, and they can't really govern like the minority. And there's all these different kind of takes on how you need to do that. Massey is really trying to do it. I mean, again, I don't agree with all of his positions, but I mean, he's operating under a we're in total control mode, and you're not. And likewise, I think you have other Republicans trying to operate in we're in the minority, but you're also not, even though all they control is the House. And I hear what you're saying about the need for that kind of maybe the deal, if we're right that there's been a deal, or if you're right that there is a maybe the hope, we're going to see where this takes. Maybe we get a deal out of it one way or the other. I think it is because we have one of the most narrow Congresses we've ever had, houses we've ever had in history, and it's for those of people and you're like listening to it and you're following it, I think it's easy to forget how historically weird it is right now on those fronts. You don't think of your own time as being the outlier.
No, although Pelosi had similarly narrow margins recently, and she did get a lot done with that. Like she maintained complete, perfect discipline with the Democrats during that time. But now the difference,
of course, was she wasn't facing an opposite party president that particular juncture.
No, that's true. But McCarthy and then Johnson, even though they had majorities, they mostly couldn't hold their own majorities together. I was suggesting
that the larger governmental arrangement of balance of power might explain some of Pelosi's ability to better manage that narrow margin. That was all.
Oh, I see. You're saying because of the fact that if the House could pass something, then it was more likely that the Senate would also pass it and the president would also sign it. Yeah, yep. I agree with that. Yeah. I agree with that. But I also just think she's a better leader. And I also think the Republicans have some crazier members. And for those reasons, she did a better job keeping her coalition together.
I hear that, although I'll be honest. I mean, it's not like Democrats don't have some crazy people in there. We'll get to that in a different day.
But she had a lot of unanimous votes of Democrats. She did not lose a lot of Democratic votes when she had a very thin majority.
I still would put more. I am not suggesting that Pelosi was not a keen political operator at all, but I do think she had some structural variables that helped her.
Agreed. Yeah.
So my goodness, we're going to need to move to our next story, and this is one. It has both been a big story and not a big story, kind of depending on where you're looking. NPR has covered it itself a lot. Conservative outlets have certainly covered it, and then it's started to emerge more broadly with coverage by the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. But this week was kind of almost a whiplash of things. NPR suspended one of their business reporters of over 2 decades, Yuri Berliner, after he penned a piece on the platform called Free Press, outlining in his views the way in which NPR had become a less ideologically diverse place. As he pointed out, NPR now has a staff without any conservative voices, any right-leaning populist voices, or even any broadly Republican voices. As a matter of fact, by his own scorecard, 87 journalists to 0. His work actually reminded me, I don't know if you remember this, Ken, kind of a smaller version of Bernard Goldberg's book Bias, published Doesn't feel like it's been that long ago, but way back in 2001, when he basically looked at how CBS News had carefully used framing and priming to work not overtly for specific ideological viewpoints, but simply because there were no reporters on the ground who weren't looking for that and therefore had pushed it in that kind of direction. And so as a result, that ideological viewpoint of the staff became the framing for CBS in Goldberg's view. And that is kind of in similar ways what Berliner was doing here. He looked at kind of three major examples, including the Mueller report, the Biden laptop story, and the coverage of COVID, as items that left reasonable positions in coverage. As he put it, one person in the newsroom said, quote, "Even if it's true, we can't help Trump," end quote. And so the idea that a story might lend to a conservative or worse Trumpian outcome meant that kind of what he saw as being that pursuit, the traditional pursuit of NPR journalistic truth, had taken a back seat. It was a well-written, provocative argument that I thought was undoubtedly worth consideration, but it did end up putting Uri in suspension. And as a matter of fact, he then published that he had a final warning letter that suggested that if he did anything like that again, he'd be fired. Of course, NPR, we found out yesterday, never got a chance. NPR's new CEO from the tech industry, Catherine Mayer, published a note that said that anyone, quote, had questions whether our people are serving our mission with integrity based on little more than the recognition of their identity is profoundly disrespectful, hurtful, and demeaning, end quote. Wednesday, responding to that larger kind of attack on him by Mayer, Berliner resigned and responded to Mayer, saying, quote, "I respect the integrity of my colleagues and wish for NPR to thrive and do important journalism," he would write in that letter that he had posted on X. He would continue by saying, "But I cannot work in a newsroom where I'm disparaged by a new CEO whose divisive views confirm the very problems I cite in my Free Press essay," end quote. So several prominent NPR journalists have countered the impression of Berliner, saying, quote, "We have a strong, heated editorial debates every day to try and get the most appropriate language and nuanced reporting in a landscape that is divisive and difficult to work in as a journalist." That was Fidel, host of Morning Edition, talking with The Post. Others inside of NPR have called the essay a bad faith effort. Of course, Republicans kind of like, again, back and said, well, yeah, a lot of people have seen this before, and this is a problem. There isn't ideological viewpoint differences. So, Ken, we have both kind of the original question of that, which I think is a long-going question, both in scholarly fields and the practitioners of the questions of media. But then we have the interesting sideline of what happens to Uri himself during the whole process of airing that. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the whole episode played out very, very much exactly as it should have. I think it's good that NPR didn't fire him. I think the criticism that the CEO dealt out at him was entirely deserved. And I think that he shouldn't really be working there. So it's good that he resigned. His article, where he criticized NPR, it was not up to NPR standard of journalism, that article itself. Like, for instance, you cited his statistic that he says NPR has 87 registered Democrats and 0 registered Republicans. Well, I mean, the number of journalists who work in that newsroom is 660. So if you say 87 are Democrats and 0 are Republicans, and you don't put in that context that there's 660 employees and he doesn't know what the others are, that's a very distorted kind of way to describe what's going on there. And I think that largely is most of what he was doing. In fact, I think even the idea, and I certainly wouldn't refute his point that most people who work there are probably Democrats. I'm sure that's true. But it's not at all, that's not itself a bona fide basis of criticism. In fact, I think that kind of plays into like the Trumpian kind of worldview that there's no such thing as, objective journalism or objective public service or objective higher education or anything like that, that everything is partisan and therefore you have to have a partisan spoils system. So to simply say, that, well, it can't be a valid news source because there's more Democrats working there than Republicans. I mean, is he going to say the same thing about the math departments in American higher ed? Because math professors are also about 75% Democratic, and is he saying that that's infecting or polluting the way they're teaching math in the classrooms? And conversely, are we going to say that the small business community in America is biased because the small business community in America is mostly Republican? It's I think it's just possible for people to sort based on the same kinds of individual preferences and ideas that make people be either a Democrat or a Republican. Those preferences or ideas may sort them into certain kinds of occupations where Democrats are going to be overrepresented in some occupations and Republicans are going to be overrepresented in other occupations. But that doesn't necessarily say anything at all about how they're going to do their job. And really, the only example he gave of what he's talking about where he claimed the coverage was biased is this Hunter Biden story. And, the Hunter Biden story, I don't think the coverage was biased at all. Even though it probably is a fair criticism to say that NPR thought that the emails were Russian disinformation, and later they generally turned out to be authentic. That alone does not mean that it was a story worth covering. There is actually nothing about that story that made it worth covering at the time of the election. It would have been, much more prejudicial. It would have been inflammatory to bring up in an election. It had really nothing to do with Joe Biden or with the electoral issues.
Now, I hear you, but I will say, one of the examples you gave in the calendar was to say, well, are we going to claim that kind of, businesses, small businesses, medium businesses, et cetera, as a result of them being Republican, are they biased? But the ideological framework in which you exist generally actually says yes to that question, though, Ken, right? That is in fact what Bernie Sanders and others argue on the regular is that those individuals are in fact biased in certain ways and therefore do kind of terrible things. I think
not in ways that affect their ability to do their job. When I walk into Ace Hardware and I talk to the owner operator about what paint would be good paint, the fact that he's a Republican, I don't know that he is, but I'll just assume that he is. That has literally nothing to do with our interaction, and I can certainly trust his advice about paint, and I can trust him to be giving me a good deal. The way people do their jobs.
That's yes to the point you said that there was a good deal, but then undoubtedly he is probably exploiting you in some way.
I don't believe that. I believe that people can.
I'm not trying to impose that on you specifically, Ken. I'm just saying, but that is in fact a broad swath. And again, I'm not trying to misrepresent anybody's view, but that is in fact a broad swath of leftist ideological standard position point, right? So
not on NPR. That's not how NPR would ever report anything.
Well, so I guess, okay, let's bring it back around to NPR. I guess the question then I have is, I'm not going to go all the way down the line to say, yes, as the way you suggest that there is no objectivity. I've been on this show too long for anybody to be able to even stand for that because I have made that claim repeatedly, right? However, the very reason I like doing the politics guys and being in these other elements is I do believe that by having a variety of viewpoints in and out, you do hear, experience, and deal with things differently than you do when you don't hit those. And so I do think, so for example, when you and I have interactions, that what our outcome from those interactions on this show would be very fundamentally different. And I think anybody who's listened to the show, say when Jay and I have done it, would say, man, things are really different when Jay and Trey have done a show than when Ken and Trey have done the show. And I don't think that's because any of us disagree about the fundamental objectivity of what we're doing. I think that's one of the reasons we can do what we do. But I do think that the outcome of those interactions are, in fact, fundamentally different. It's the same kind of reasoning, albeit please put it in a different kind of category when you talk about, why was higher education for so long vastly different before we had, when we had we still have gender disparity, but additional gender disparity. Good academic friends of mine were talking about that. As a matter of fact, today and yesterday. having those conversations and having women in the room change those kinds of outcomes. So I hear you that we might take point of Yuri and say, well, look, how accurate is this? But I would suggest that there is something important that comes from having ideological diversity, even if we accept.
Yeah, I just can't agree that that's universally true. I think, of course, it's true on the politics guys, right? The whole point of our show is to do political opinion, political commentary, and look at it from different perspectives. And so that's only going to work if we bring some ideology to it, and if we're open about what our ideologies are. But I'll go back to my example of math professors who teach calculus or teach differential equations or whatever. In fact, they're just as as higher ed is mostly Democratic, but that's equally as true in math departments and science departments as it is in politics departments or history departments or law schools. And I think you have to look at that differently, right? I mean, I can't see how that could possibly make any difference at all, when someone's teaching calculus or teaching differential equations, whether they're Democratic or Republican. And I think that what this guy Berliner is doing, he's basically importing what I sort of consider a very Trumpian construction, that all civic space is just strictly a partisan exercise. And so you can judge, how everybody performs their job based on their political affiliation.
But I don't think that's, I don't think he's taking, I don't disagree with you about the Trumpian portion of that. But what I will say, though, is let's go to the objective side of this, right? As a scholar of political communication, we certainly know that framing effects, priming effects, agenda setting effects are the deep and important ways in which we are impacted by media. And we also know that the ways that we don't always, the intention isn't always from news organizations to even potentially have certain kinds of outcomes. So one kind of oftentimes outcome is we tend to have personalized narratives, because framing that takes place on personalized narratives is more well received than those that are from structural points of view, because they take more abstract reasoning, and that's not as connecting and long lasting. And so when you take a listen to stories, there is in fact kind of across the board, there are biases in the frames towards personalized narratives. And I say that's not as a criticism. That's going to out in the nature of media. But your analogy here to suggest that if a journalist is kind of perfectly doing their story, that they will somehow transcend those known effects, that itself seems a little bit outside of our social science research. I'll stop there for a second.
Yeah, but if you want to criticize the reporting, then criticize the reporting. And I mean, he criticized the Hunter Biden reporting. I think he was completely wrong in his criticisms. He didn't really criticize much of the other reporting, but he just criticized the reporters and the CEO. And that kind of ad hominem form of argument, I think is not a legitimate form of argument. And if he thinks that they've covered things wrong, he should say, what they covered wrong and what was wrong about the way they covered it. And not, and the fact that they didn't want to believe, Rudy Giuliani delivering what appeared to be more Russian-backed disinformation at the last minute without, trying to look behind it. I don't think that's a valid criticism at all.
Well, I think we're running low, so I want to get one more story in, Ken, because I thought it was a unique one that we'll probably come back to again before we run out of the way time, and that is a recent Supreme Court decision. I wanted to get to the Supreme Court, if nothing else.
Sure.
And so on Monday, the Supreme Court rejected a First Amendment appeal for activist DeRay McKesson against a police officer who is anonymous, who is suing him for damages as a result of being injured at a Black Lives Matters protest in 2016. Now, the facts of the case in McKesson v. Doe are this. Days after police fatally shot Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, McKesson organized a protest at which demonstrators blocked a highway outside a local police station. As police cleared the roadway, the officer, identified as John Doe, was hit with a, quote, rock-like object, end quote, and ended up suffering a brain trauma, among other injuries, according to the court filings. McKesson did not throw the object. It isn't no one's even arguing that he did, and it's undisputed that he ever authorized any kind of violence. But the officer claimed that McKesson's leadership at the event still makes him liable for the unidentified culprit's action. The lawsuit against McKesson argues, quote, he knew or should have known that violence would result as a result of the demonstration. The case had already come up to the Supreme Court, and they'd sent it back to the Fifth Circuit with instructions to seek guidance from the Louisiana Supreme Court on whether state law would even be able to find McKesson to be held liable. And the answer was, in fact, yes. So McKesson returned to the Supreme Court last fall, asking the justices to weigh in. But after considering the case at 7 consecutive conferences, the justices ended up denying review. Now, Sona Sotomayor actually penned a statement regarding the court's decision to deny review, and she basically noted that since the Court of Appeals issued its decision, the Supreme Court has already made clear in Counterman v. Ohio that the First Amendment bars the use of an objective standard like negligence for punishing speech, end quote. So the case may be turned down, quote, for many reasons, end quote, Sotomayor stressed in the denial of the review, and it has no claims about the merit, although that seems really weird given where we're at. And so obviously, even some of the liberal justices were not willing to bring this vote up on First Amendment grounds, which means it's going to head back and actually head to trial. So Ken, this seemed, we've been going through in the exclusive supporter show, the Constitution, and we recently, not that long ago, it's been a few months ago now, done the First Amendment. I wouldn't have thought this. So can you kind of give us some reasoning here? I'm curious of your thoughts.
Yeah, so it's, as you pointed out, there's a lot of backstory here because this case has been to the Supreme Court once before. It's been to the Fifth Circuit twice, and the second time it was en banc. And in fact, the en banc, that means they get all 16 judges, which is unusual. And when that happened, they divided 8-8, and it's on its third trip back to the district court now. So it's had a very long procedural history. But if I can try to simplify what I think has happened at this round. As you, of course, explained well, the plaintiff in this case is a policeman who got hit in the head with a rock while he was policing a Black Lives Matter protest. And he sued one of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter protest, not under the theory that that guy threw the rock, but just under the theory that that guy, by organizing this protest, created the conditions that made it reasonably foreseeable that a rock would be thrown and someone would get injured. And so that's essentially the form of negligence that he's suing the Black Lives Matter organizer for. So there were a lot of issues in the case, both state law and federal constitutional law. The state law of negligence, there's the states get to decide what counts as negligence, what kind of thing can be a tort. Louisiana actually has a law called the Professional Rescuers Doctrine that generally says policemen assume the risk of injury while working and can't sue for such injuries. And so for a long time, it looked like just that Louisiana law would make this suit have to go away. But the U.S. Supreme Court sent that to the Louisiana Supreme Court to determine that, and the Louisiana Supreme Court determined that that law for some reason didn't apply here, so the police suit could go forward under Louisiana law, and that brought it back to the
and that
the
was
First
confusing
Amendment.
in and of itself, to be real honest. But anyway, continue. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was a fairly result-oriented holding. It seems inconsistent with the way Louisiana law had previously been interpreted, but that's what kind of brought it back up to the Supreme Court a second time, because I think when the Supreme Court sent it to the Louisiana Supreme Court, they fully expected the Louisiana Supreme Court to say, well, under our tort law, policemen can't sue people.
So it's done. Yeah.
It's done. Yeah, we don't need to get into all these constitutional questions. But the Louisiana Supreme Court went the other way on that and made some changes to their state tort law, which state Supreme Courts can do. And so now the case is going forward again. What the trial court said is that the trial court was reversed by the Fifth Circuit. But what the trial court said was that the First Amendment right to peaceably assemble gives people a constitutional right to organize kind of in-person protests or demonstrations as long as they do it peaceably, and then it protects them against any kind of liability if outside of their control, the demonstration turns violent. So the district court did find that the organizers had First Amendment protection under their right to peaceably assemble. That ended up getting reversed by a panel of the Fifth Circuit, a 3-judge panel of the Fifth Circuit, who said, well, it depends. So what the Fifth Circuit said was, ordinarily that would be true. But there's an exception to that if the organizer did more than just organize the demonstration. If the organizer did something that contributed in a more material way to this injury, to this violence that happened, beyond just organizing the protest, and we don't know whether he did that or not. So this needs to go back to the trial court for a trial on the facts. And so when the Fifth Circuit ruled that, then that got petitioned up to the en banc Fifth Circuit. And because they divided 8-8 on that, an 8-8 tie vote in an en banc has the effect of just leaving the 3-judge panel's decision in place. So the Fifth Circuit couldn't resolve it when they en banced it. So that 3-judge panel decision that said this needs to go back to trial, the trial court needs to determine whether the defendant in this case did anything more than merely organize the protest. If he merely organized the protest, he's within his First Amendment rights and there can't be liability. But if he contributed in a more material way than that to causing the injury to the policeman, he could lose his First Amendment rights. And then that's the decision that the U.S. Supreme Court just refused to intervene in. Now, I think it makes sense that they would refuse to intervene, not only for the reasons that Justice Sotomayor said, which is that Sotomayor thought that other intervening Supreme Court cases had already resolved this. But I also think, there is actually probably a need for some more factual development here about what the defendant actually did, and that's what the Fifth Circuit sent it back to the trial court to look into. There never was a trial yet. There's been a lot of rounds of litigation, but all of the rounds of litigation have been about whether there could be a trial or not. So there's been no trial, and so I think if the trial happens. And if it is found by a jury that this organizer did in fact play a more material, specific role in getting a rock thrown at this particular police officer, I don't think he's going to have any First Amendment right to have done that. If on the other hand, it ends up that he's held liable merely for his role in organizing a protest that perhaps foreseeably could have wound up with some violence, I think at that point in time, the Supreme Court will take that case, even though they didn't take it now.
Gotcha. Well, that's what I was hoping to hear. I was very curious. Well, Ken, thank you so much for that. But before we get done here today, I need to give a shout out to a new project coming out with Mike and his wife and fellow political scientist, Kimberly, called Sustainable Planet. The podcast is a rational, open-minded approach to sustainability, environmental issues, and guess what? It is live right now. Sustainable Planet explains sustainability is, why it matters, consumption, animal agriculture, with upcoming episodes on food waste, climate footprints, climate shadows, and so much more. I'm most interested in fast fashion because I've never owned anything in my life. At least on that front. I have clothes from that are so old that, that's story. But be that as it may, listeners, if you want to tune in to Mike and Kimberly's new podcast, as you can just head over to the show's website, which is splanetpod.com. So splanetpod.com. And that's going to be down in the show notes as well if you want to get there really well. Now, just a heads up, I know it's going to be a blast because I actually had both Mike and Kimberly as professors at NKU. Now, I'm 40, so we're not going to do any math. I know, Ken, we were talking about math. We won't do any math. We won't say what that means in terms of Mike and Kimberly. But a lot of my love for what I do actually comes from my time at NKU and both of them. As a matter of fact, I remember taking international political economy with Kimberly. And as a matter of fact, it's really hard for me to call. It took me forever to call Mike because he's, but he was the doctor. And same thing with Kimberly. And it's even as I'm saying this, it's hard at 40 to do that. One of my funniest memories about that was there's been this class, I was answering all these questions for her. And at one point, she finally just shushed me because she wanted to get somebody else to, nobody else had done the reading. So anyway, I have a great love. They do lots of fun stuff. I'm looking forward to it myself. So again, that's going to be down there in the show notes. It's going to be a really cool product from the two of them. And I know that Mike, who was a little bit to the right of Kimberly, they're going to have some differences. And so it's going to be a lot of fun. You should check out the show and check out the show on the show's website. Now, additionally, if you're not already a supporter of the Politics Guys, I really hope you'll consider becoming one. Without you guys, that's how we get the podcast going, and becoming a supporter gets you a lot of cool stuff, including our Discord group, which I talk about regularly. So if you want to be a part of that, if you want to be like Estevam, who made that really cool donation, we would really appreciate that. And you can do that in one of a number of ways. So let me run you through those ways right now. You can head to patreon.com/politicsguys, or like Estevam, you can support us on Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. All of those links are in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. If you've got any kind of questions, you can always email us at mail@politics.com. We're also on Facebook and X, and you'll find all of those links, including the new podcast, in the show notes. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilmer Marino, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode next week, and I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,